from North India as well as from East of India. Our first speaker is Dr. Vishnu. He's gone for the Colonel Rangachari Award, so he'll be joining us and he'll be telling us about the clinical evaluation. Next is Dr. Bhavna Chawla, so I invite her to make a presentation about the investigative tools which are necessary for the diagnosis of orbital tumor. She's an additional professor from Dr. R.P. Center.
So a very good morning to all of you. And at the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. C.V. Sain for giving me an opportunity to give a talk in this session on orbital tumors. And I'll be starting with investigative tools that are usually used for the diagnosis of orbital tumors. And basically the tools that I'm going to cover in my talk include B-scan ultrasonography of the orbit, the CT scan, the MRI, the FDG PET scan. These are all radiological investigations. And finally, we'll be touching upon FMSA, the details of which will be covered by my colleagues in subsequent presentations. So first of all, coming to the B-scan ultrasound. The main advantages of ultrasound in orbital tumors is that it gives us a very quick assessment of the lesion. We're also able to know the kinetic properties of the tumor, and it also helps us in examination of pediatric cases without anesthesia, because for CT and MRI we require general anesthesia in most of the children. Then the other main advantage is that there is no radiation exposure like CT scan. Again, it is an inexpensive tool and ideal for serial follow-up. It may be difficult to order CT and MRIs every 2 or 3 months, like we can do the ultrasound. And then the ultrasound, the thing is that it is performed by the ophthalmologist, so it is very easy to do a clinical corroboration. However, there are certain limitations of ultrasound. First of all, diffuse lesions, it may be difficult to assess simply by doing an ultrasound. Then again, lesions that are located posteriorly in the orbit, we do not get much information on the ultrasound. Finally, there is an inter-observer variation, and it is a highly operator-dependent investigation because the results may be very subjective and interpretation depends upon the experience of the person who is doing it. Now, when we do an ultrasound B-scan, we have to remember there are 3 scans essentially that are used: the longitudinal scan, the transverse scan, and the axial scan. The longitudinal scan helps us to know the lateral extent of the lesion, the transverse scan tells us about the anterior-posterior extent, and the axial scan is mainly for the retrobulbous phase. A combined approach gives us an idea about the 3-dimensional view of the orbit. So, orbital ultrasonography should be mainly used to visualize anterior and middle orbital lesions. That is not the ideal imaging modality for posterior lesions. It's a very good adjunct to CT scan. And first, the most important information it gives us is whether the lesion is solid or cystic, it's heterogeneous or homogeneous. Now, I'll be just giving you some examples and representative B-scans of what these look like. Some orbital tumors are simply diagnostic on ultrasound. For example, a cavernous hemangioma, where the lesion shows moderate to high amplitude spikes. There is moderate sound attenuation. On A scan, we see what we typically call the dancing spikes, and there is no internal vascularity. Cysticercosis is another lesion which is a straightaway giveaway on ultrasound because it's very nicely demonstrated. You can see the scolex over here in the center of the cyst, and that is very typical and characteristic of cysticercosis. Now, lymphangioma is another lesion which on ultrasound gives us a lot of information. You can see over here this large lymphangioma occupying the right orbit, and internal septations can be seen. Now, sometimes ultrasound can be combined with Doppler ultrasonography, which tells us a little bit more about the orbital vasculature and the blood flow. One indication of this is orbital varices. As you can see over here, before Valsalva and after Valsalva, typically there is increase in the blood flow and the vascularity. Now, this is an example of color Doppler of the ophthalmic artery. Over here you can see these amplitudes on color Doppler, and this is basically because of normal blood flow within the ophthalmic artery. Now, this is an example where if there is a malignant tumor of the eye, the amplitude simply increases because tumors tend to be more vascular. So this can also be picked up on color Doppler. Another indication of color Doppler, of course it's not specific for orbital tumors, but it is nevertheless important, is the differentiation between PHPV and retinoblastoma in many cases. PHPV shows up as a very nice band and with vascularity inside, because it's because of the persistent hyaloid vasculature, which is not seen in retinoblastoma. The next investigative tool for diagnosis that I'll be covering is CT scan of the orbit, which is a very valuable and handy tool. Now, CT is sufficient and necessary for most orbital lesions, and it suffices here to say that MRI is rarely needed. CT tells you about the location, the extent, and the effect on adjacent structures. The tissue characteristics can be noted on CT, and it helps in surgical planning. For example, the approach that one should take for an orbitotomy. Now, indications of CT scan apart from orbital tumors are other conditions like orbital cellulitis, ocular surface or lid tumors where there is suspected orbital and post-septal invasion, intraocular tumors that present with proptosis, and other cases of orbital trauma and unexplained afferent dysfunction. Now, for CT scan, generally for the orbit, 2 mm slice thickness is used. Thinner slices usually lead to more radiation and are more time consuming. The standard views that we see on CT are the axial view, the coronal view, and the sagittal view. Simultaneous brain CT can also be done, and CT with contrast is typically indicated where we want to visualize structures such as optic chiasma, the pericellular region, extraorbital extension, and vascular lesions. So this is on CT. Typically you can see on the left is the bone window and on the right is the soft tissue window. As far as proptosis due to orbital tumors is concerned, on CT the interzygomatic line is used as the reference point to know the amount of proptosis. The other things that we can know on CT are the size of the lesion, it's how circumscribed it is, the shape, the margins, what is the surrounding structures like, consistency of the lesion, if there are any bony changes, and of course the location. So this is how in a case of proptosis, the red line is the interzygomatic line. On the left side you can see the proptosis, which is because of a space-occupying lesion in the left orbit. Coming to vascular orbital masses on CT, the cavernous hemangioma typically appears as a well-demarcated contrast-enhancing lesion that is usually intraconal. Capillary hemangioma shows a well-demarcated homogeneous lesion which is also contrast-enhancing but most commonly extraconal. And lymphangioma is a heterogeneous lesion with minimal enhancement. So some representative pictures here of what these lesions look on CT. Here you can see a very well circumscribed intraconal cavernous hemangioma showing contrast enhancement on CT. This is a case of a lymphangioma where you can see all these cystic and solic areas. Many times there are chocolate cysts within the lymphangioma and internal septations can be identified. So lymphangioma like cavernous hemangioma is almost a giveaway as far as orbital tumors are concerned on imaging itself. This is a case where you can see a nice phlebolith inside in the right orbit within the orbital tumor. And then lacrimal gland lesions also CT is very useful. It shows about the extent of the lesion and if there are any bony changes. So this is a case of a pleomorphic adenoma of the right orbit, and you can see a well-defined mass where the lacrimal gland is not seen separately from the mass. It's in the supratemporal region arising from the lacrimal gland, almost homogeneous with no bony changes. This is again another view of the pleomorphic adenoma, what we call as the coronal section. Adenoid cystic carcinoma usually also shows up as a mass. So this is a tumor which has posterior extension into the cavernous sinus. This is the axial view of the CT, and this is the sagittal view where you can see the same tumor. The tumor is extending into the roof of the orbit. It's eroding through the roof and extending intracranially, and it appears as a mid-posterior mass. There is also incidental maxillary sinusitis. This is the coronal view, again showing the same findings: extension through the roof, a mid-posterior mass, and a maxillary sinusitis. So orbital abscess sometimes is another differential diagnosis of orbital tumors, and CT scan is very useful in diagnosing orbital abscess and in differentiating it from orbital tumors. Subperiosteal hematoma, as you can see over here, usually following trauma, is again a very common differential of any benign or malignant orbital tumor. because subperiosteal hematoma can also be subacute to chronic, and many times CT is necessary after trauma to rule out any other tumor. Aspergillosis is an invasive fungal condition. Again, many of these patients present with a subacute course and a mass, and many times CT and MRI is done in these cases. Of course, the final diagnosis in these cases rests on histopathologic findings. Then inherited cyst over here, as you can see in our country, it is not very uncommon to see these kind of pictures on CT where you have one globe and you feel there is another globe behind that, but actually it is a case of inherited cyst. You can see this giant cyst just behind the globe, and this is also almost a giveaway on imaging. Dermoid is again an important and common orbital tumor in our clinical setting. So this is a case of dermoid. Over here again you can see more or less a cystic mass, and dermoid has characteristic locations like supratemporal or supranasal orbit where the suture lines are present. Myositis can also be seen in many cases and picked up nicely on CT where you have the thickening of the muscle belly or the muscle tendon, and it could be due to idiopathic orbital inflammation or some other causes where the muscle is involved. For example, thyroid ophthalmopathy, again you can see thickening of the muscles very nicely. So this is trauma or blowout fracture of the orbit, not a part of orbital tumors, but nevertheless CT is important in the differential. Optic nerve glioma and meningioma again can be picked up on CT, although the radiologist does advise MRI scan in these cases to better evaluate the soft tissue structures. Keratoconcavernosus fistula, again you can see very nicely the dilated superior ophthalmic vein over here, and it shows low reflectivity and marked blood flow, and it's also VCT is very valuable in this diagnosis. Orbital foreign body, I'll just skip, although this was an interesting case. This, what you can see over here on orbital CT is actually a sugar cane. The patient had a penetrating trauma due to sugarcane, and you can see this is the sugarcane which is embedded in the orbit, and this is the foreign body which is seen in the whole thing over here, and of course the patient lost his vision. So this lymphoma is another orbital tumor which really wraps around the orbital structures very nicely, and therefore it doesn't cause any bony changes. And again, but the final diagnosis of lymphoma rests on histopathology. PET scan is an emerging imaging modality for orbital tumors, and it measures in vivo concentration and movement of a positron emitting radiotracer. The radiotracer that we commonly use in PET is 2-deoxy-18F-fluoro-D-glucose, which is an analog of glucose. And basically the principle of PET is that this radiotracer is taken up more actively by the tumor cells that are metabolically more active than the normal cells. So this is the mechanism of 18F-FDG uptake. And PET-CT comprises basically both PET and CT on the same gantry. There is real-time fusion of these modalities, and PET scan measures in vivo basically the concentration and movement of the radiotracer, and CT is combined with PET because it gives better localization and anatomical delineation and definition of the abnormal radiotracer uptake. So this is an example of PET-CT in the orbit. Over here you can see, what you see here is actually the physiological uptake of the radiotracer by the brain, which is normal, but in the orbit what you see is abnormal, because this is increased FDG uptake of the orbital tumor, which is malignant. Now the other investigative tool for diagnosis is MRI. The main indications for MRI is when we are suspecting tumor spread like intracranial extension, extrascleral extension, and optic nerve involvement. It also helps in leukocoria to differentiate retinoblastoma from lesions such as PHPV and Coats. It's very useful for intracorneal masses, vascular lesions, and of course there are other indications like demyelinating disease, optic nerve lesions. Now most tumors appear hypointense on T1 and hyperintense on T2 enhanced with gadolinium. So the main contraindications where MRI should not be used is where there is a ferrous metallic foreign body, or there is an aneurysm clip, a cochlear implant, or a cardiac pacemaker. So before ordering an MRI, one should be sure that the patient doesn't have any of these. And the main limitation of MRI is that bone is not imaged as well as in CT. So this is a T1 weighted MR image where you can see that the intraocular, the vitreous is dark. This is a T2 weighted where you can see that the vitreous is bright. So this is basically a case of retinoblastoma. CT shows calcification here. This is another case where MRI was done because there was overt orbital spread, and it shows the entire extent of the soft tissue invasion. So the optic nerve glioma, again MRI is better than CT to better delineate the short soft tissue characteristics. I'll just be touching a little bit about FNAC over here. And fine needle aspiration biopsy is a rapid non-invasive technique. The needle is introduced in the mass and aspirated. Slides are immediately fixed in alcohol. The two states that are routinely done are Papanicolaou and Maigret-Wald-Jimsa. The main indication is if there is any palpable mass in the eyelid or adnexa or the orbit, and even if there are palpable lymph nodes, then we like to go ahead with an FNAC to know whether it is reactive lymphadenitis or whether there is actually tumor invasion in the lymph node. So this is the FNAC handle, and this is the Coughlin jar. And basically a needle is used, 23 gauge 1-inch needle, 10 ml syringes. The slides should be clean, dry and labeled. The fixative is 95% alcohol. FNAC handle is used, and the alcohol-filled smear is to be stained by the PAP stain, and the air-dried smears are stained by the MGG stain. So details of pathology will be covered by Dr. Seema Sen and Dr. Seema Kashyap. The main advantages of FNAP are that it is rapid, cheap and safe. It's reliable, relatively painless procedure, and even if you have a negative result on FNAC, it can still give you some guideline and information for further line of investigation, and it can obviate the need for unnecessary surgery, for example if patients need radiotherapy. So these are some slides of FNAC, so sebaceous cell carcinoma. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna, for the wonderful presentation. If you have any questions to Dr. Bhavna, we can have maybe just one question and then move on to the next speaker. Any questions for investigations for orbital tumors? If there are none, then I'll invite the next speaker. I'll invite Dr. Usha to tell us about the surgical approaches which are used for orbital lesions.
Approaches to the orbit. As we know that orbit is a small cavity inhospitable to the surgeon because it's crowded with vital tissues. Orbital exploration from the anterior aspect would involve deep three-dimensional view with a very poor visibility. Anatomic relationship between the structures in an orbital cone adds to the difficulty in exploration. Therefore, it becomes essential to have an adequate exposure of the surgical field, and this starts with a proper selection of the skin and bone incisions. CT scans and MRI advances have become crucial to accurately describe the location of a lesion and its relationship with adjacent orbital and cranial structures, and we are fortunate to have these advances. An orbital surgeon needs to review the microsurgical anatomy of the orbit, and this author, Carolina Martins, she has described that each orbit can be compared to a tiny jewel box that has very precious contents, all carefully wrapped in fat tissue. So, mass lesions which are located in the anterior two-thirds, they are approached extracranially, and lesions located in the apical area, especially the medial side, require transcranial approach. Orbital compartment divisions can be as anterior versus posterior, superior inferior, medial lateral. Surgical approach is planned according to these spaces. As we can see over here, the intraconal space. This is the intraconal space, this yellow highlighted, and here the highlighted yellow is the extraconal space over here. So the reasons for surgery in a tumor containing orbit could be any of the three. Either we are doing it to just have a biopsy, or to partially excise it, or to have a total removal of the tumor. So coming to this thing, summarizing. So there are two main approaches: the transorbital approach, where the septum is orbit is entered through the septum or through the subperiosteal space, and the extraorbital approach, which is best performed in collaboration with the neuro or the ENT surgeon. We can see what it means. This is done by the neurosurgeons, and this is by the ENT surgeons. The extraorbital approaches, the frontotemporal approach is with or without osteotomy, and this is mainly for lesions of the posterior third. And the considerations again here are location, size and goal of the surgery. The inferior orbital approach, they are lesions located inferiorly and posteriorly between the optic nerve and the inferior rectus, and they are best performed in collaboration with an ENT surgeon. Now, the topographic classification of the orbital lesions, they can be divided into periorbit, which could be intradural as seen over here, where the mass is between the muscle and the periorbit, or it could be extradural, where it is in the orbital wall, or it is in the subperiosteal space. The other location is a muscular cone, and it could be intraconal. Again, this intraconal could be medial, central or lateral as seen here in this diagram, or it could be extraconal. The lesion could be arising from the optic nerve itself, or the lesion could be localized to the superior orbital fissure. The tumor location and size, they decide the approach. Now, anterior lesions require anterior orbitotomy, and this could be superior inferior. If it is a large lesion, large anterior superior lesion, then additional osteotomy may be required. Large anterolateral lesions are approached via the lateral approach. Smaller anteriorly placed medial lesions require a medial orbitotomy. Large or posteriorly located medial lesions, they require combined lateral and medial orbitotomy. And any anterior approach would give a view up to 60 degrees. Now we'll go into the examples of this. Just before we go to the examples, the anterior approaches, they could be transseptal or subconjunctival, and superior could be again transseptal or subperiosteal. Similarly for the inferior, but inferior it is generally inferior transseptal orbitotomy. Now coming to the skin incisions, the skin incisions are the supraorbital eyebrow incision, the upper lid incision, or a canthotomy is done for some of these lesions located on the lateral side. The other skin incisions are subciliary incision, subtarsal incision, and infraorbital incision. And there is one more incision, the modified S-shaped incision for lateral orbitotomy. All incisions are given parallel to the relaxed skin tension lines to minimize scar formation. Now, how is orbital surgery different from other ophthalmic techniques? Here, the surgical maneuvers, they alternate between relatively gross techniques and fine or microscopic ones. So, an orbital surgeon must be able to navigate in deep tissue planes, must be able to recognize veins, arteries and nerves, must be able to prevent and control significant bleeding, must be familiar with the surgical bone techniques, because some of the orbital procedures require demolition and reconstruction of the orbital walls. And here it is important that the anesthesia team should be acquainted with this type of surgery, and so that they keep the patient in the low hypotensive condition during the surgery. Now coming to this examples, now here is a lesion which is a fairly well defined lesions, moderately enhancing and located in the anterior orbit. So as we can see, the space between the globe and the lateral wall is just sufficient for it to come out from the anterior approach. However, if this lesion were located somewhere in the posterior orbit, then it would require either a combination lateral orbitotomy and superior orbitotomy, or through the transcranial approach. Now, if the same lesion was located on the medial side as seen over here, then it would require a subconjunctival approach or the medial orbitotomy, and here an incision is given on the caruncle and the medial rectus muscle, there may be a need to disinsert the medial rectus muscle, or it may not be, depending on the exact location. If it is extracoral, then you don't need to disinsert the muscle. Now, here is another large lesion. It's fairly large, as you can see, but it is lying in the anteroposterior axis. And this lesion, we are suspecting a cavernous hemangioma. And so cavernous hemangiomas, as we know, it has a plasticity to it. So these large lesions can come out from a smaller incisions, as seen over here. So tumor plasticity allows larger lesion to be delivered from a much smaller skin approach. However, if the same lesion was a very firm, hard lesion, then you would have to do a lateral orbitotomy over here. Here is a video showing a large lesion coming out from the anterior approach. You can see how large it is, and it has come out easily because, again, this is a cavernous hemangioma, and its anterior portion was presenting pretty anterior, so we could just apply a cryo and do a cryo extraction. Now here is another lesion. Here the size of the orbit matters over here. Now this is a lesion which is firm to hard tumor, and it is lying in the retrovulvar space and extending from side to side, medial to lateral, and it is just behind, and you can see that the bone, the orbit is expanded. It's pretty large as compared to the normal side. And the good thing about this lesion is that it's lying in the superior orbit. So instead of doing a lateral orbitotomy over here, this can come out easily from a superior approach. So a larger tumor in an expanded orbit can be removed from anterior approach. Coming to the lateral orbitotomy, these are meant for large sub-anterosuperior lesions located laterally, and they can give up to a 180 degrees view. And here we can see this, the bone, the zygomatic bone has been removed, and this is done for a large orbital dermoid. And here we can see the cheesy material over here. And usually in such large, where a lot of dead space is left behind, and there's been bleeding, then you can leave a drain. Now here in this patient, what would we like to do? Here is a osteoma, orbital osteoma, which is straddling the sinus as well as the orbit. And so here we would prefer to do a subperiosteal approach. As we can see over here, this is the periosteal edge, and the neurovascular bundle is over here, the supraorbital nerves and vessels. And a cleft is made between the supraorbital rim and the tumor. And as you can see, the attachment is all in the anterior rim, supraorbital rim. However, the posterior portion was just free, and it just needed to be lifted up. And you can see it was lifted up and rotated, and the entire thing came out in toto. And this is the big bony tumor which has come out. The osteoma has come out. And here we can see this lesion in the post-op period. You can see this is the pre-op, the superior image is the pre-op, and the other ones are the post-op, and we can see some blood collection in the superior orbit. However, this settled down with time, and we can see the axial scan, which shows that we have tackled only the orbital portion, and the rest of it is as such, and we have not breached into the nose. So this is how she looked. So any kind of surgical approach is not without complications. However, a skilled surgeon can minimize all these complications, and they could be either of these: loss of vision, CSF leaks, post-operative diplopia, eyelid malposition, post-operative ptosis, ectropion, entropion, canalicularis damage, temporary hyperesthesia, and paralysis. However, all these conditions can be minimized by a very careful selection and good investigation. There are certain adjuvants to therapy, that is microscope, which allows a better delineation of tissues, makes it safer and precise. there are neuronavigational techniques, and they allow access to areas which are normally not accessible. There are endoscopic techniques which are adjuvant to orbital approach, stereotactic surgery, and these are useful for tumors that cannot be excised completely. So coming to the conclusions, there are a variety of surgical approaches for the orbital tumors for the ophthalmologists, some in collaboration with the neuro and ENT surgeons. Aim of the surgery, tumor location, size and its nature are criteria based on which an appropriate surgical route and incisions are chosen. Orbital surgeon needs to be familiar with the microsurgical anatomy and techniques in order to have an optimal results and preservation of vision. Thank you.
Anyone has any questions regarding the surgical approaches, they can ask Dr. Usha. If there are no questions, now then I'll invite the next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Ruchi Mittal, and she'll be telling us about the pathology of pediatric tumors. Dr. Ruchi.
A warm welcome to everyone. Good morning, all of you. I would like to thank Dr. Seema Sen for giving us this opportunity. And I will be talking to you for next 10 minutes on pediatric orbital tumors. So this is the orbit, and as Dr. Usha Singh mentioned that it is a jewel box. So definitely this orbit has a volume of only 30 ml, and it can harbor a wide variety of orbital lesions, which could be neoplastic, non-neoplastic, inflammatory, and it is just within a volume of 30 ml. Everything which can occur from head to toe can also occur in the orbit. So the first question which comes into the mind of an oncologist or an ophthalmologist when a patient walks in with a orbital lesion is, what is it? And the answer is a stepwise approach which involves clinical history, thorough clinical examination, imaging, specific investigations and surgery. But the key to the diagnosis is histopathology and histopathology. So I will be just talking briefly on few orbital lesions in children. So this is the histopathological profile of 57 cases of pediatric orbital lesions in the age group of less than 14 years in the last 3 years. That is 11, 12 and 13 in LV Prasad Eye Institute in Bhubaneswar. So the most common tumor was rhabdomyosarcoma and constituted 21% of all the pediatric orbital lesions, with cystic lesions another 21%. The cystic lesions which we came across was dermoid cyst as the most common, that is 4 of 12, and the rest were teratomatous cyst, microphthalmos with cyst, a single case of congenital cystic eye, epidermoid cyst, hydatid cyst and a cysticercus cyst. Then the vasculogenic tumors forming another 17%. The most common was lymphangioma followed by capillary hemangioma. Inflammatory lesions, PNET, optic nerve and meningeal tumors contributed around 57 tumors. Then schwannomas, lymphomas, leukemias, myeloid sarcoma, and histiocytic tumors like juvenile xanthogranuloma and Rosai-Dorfman disease. So just a few slides on congenital lesions in the orbit. It could be a congenital cystic eye, also known as anophthalmia with cyst, colpomatous cyst, known as microphthalmia with cyst, cephaloceles, dermoid cyst, epidermoid cyst, teratomatous cyst, also known as a teratoma, and ectopic lacrimal gland tissue. So congenital cystic eye, it represents primitive optic vesicles which fails to undergo differentiation into its adult component, and on microscopy it has 2 layers. The outer layer is a dense collagenous tissue which resembles sclera, and the inner tissue is the primitive retinal tissue, and sometimes it can even have some fragments or some remnants of conjunctiva, and then it can be well identified on PA stain, and it can have even some retinal pigment epithelium. And then we have the colpomatous cyst. The colpomatous cyst is nothing but incomplete closure of the fetal fissure, and the disorganized cystic neuroectodermal tissue prolapses into the orbit. So this cyst also looks just like an ophthalmia with cyst on microscopy. So this is the gross picture, and this is the microscopy. When we are seeing, it's a small malformed eye here, and this is a large cyst which is sitting posterior to the malformed eye, and this malformed eye has hyperplastic retinal pigment epithelium, and this is the cyst which is sitting posteriorly, and this cyst is actually lying on the inner side again by the retinal tissue, and on the outside by dense collagenous tissue, which is nothing but looks like sclera. Coming to the epithelial cysts, the most common epithelial cyst is the dermoid cyst, and this cyst is formed by just entrapment of the epithelial tissue during embryogenesis. And this is a CT picture, and what we see on microscopy is keratinizing stratified squamous epithelial lined cyst, lumen filled with the keratinous material. This keratinous material is nothing but the cheesy material which is called by the surgeon and also by us. So, and what it contains is numerous hair follicles and adnexal structures and sebaceous glands. So, this is the thing which helps us to identify a dermoid cyst. Then the teratomatous cysts, these children presented as early as 1 day of age, and they can go very fast sometimes, and within a few weeks, like 2 to 3 weeks, this patient presented in follow-up like this. And this is the microscopy. So on microscopy examination, what we see is that there will be elements of all the 3 germ cell layers, that is ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm. The cyst will be have areas of keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium, again with this adnexal structures, hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and then you will have these lobules of highly mature cartilage. Then there will be some adipose tissue, some sweat glands. There can be respiratory epithelium. So this is a teratomatous cyst, or also known as a teratoma. Then just to tell the approach to the cystic lesions of the orbit, it could be an epithelial cyst or it could be a non-epithelial cyst. When it is an epithelial cyst, the most common is the dermoid cyst. A dermoid cyst, typical, as I've already shown you, is lined by keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium. Sometimes it can have an epithelium which looks conjunctivoid, but again it will have the adnexal structures. It could be an epidermoid cyst. Epidermoid cyst does not have the adnexal structures in the wall, and then it could be a cystic teratoma, also known as teratomatous cyst. Then the non-epithelial cyst could be the microphthalmos with cyst, a congenital cystic eye or an ophthalmic cyst, cephalocele, optic nerve sheath cyst, cysts seen in the neurogenic tumors, and then parasitic cysts. So coming to the most important and the most commonly encountered orbital tumor in childhood, that is the rhabdomyosarcoma, which is mesenchymal in origin, most commonly seen in the first decade of life. And the most common type of rhabdomyosarcoma which we come across in orbit is the embryonal type. And the other variants which can be seen is boteroid, alveolar and pleomorphic, which are rare in the orbit. So embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma can have a variable pattern, and depending upon the type of cells we see, we call it poorly differentiated or well differentiated. So when we see this tumor, this we also call it as an undifferentiated. This basically is called by a pathologist as a small round blue cell tumor. So what we see is these cells which are round, and sometimes they can even be oval to spindle, but still we call it as small round. So we see small round cells, and they have very scant cytoplasm, a dense hypochromatic nucleus, and inconspicuous nucleolus, but they were very high mitosis, and these are then known as undifferentiated small round blue cell tumors. But rhabdomyosarcoma sometimes can have cells which are differentiated and they show skeletal muscle differentiation. They have abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm which is very dense in color with an eccentric nucleus, and there will be admixed cells which are spindle in shape, or they can like elongated spindle, and some of them will be round. So when we see this is a differentiated rhabdomyosarcoma, differentiated variant. So when we get this kind of differentiated variant, we have a clue that it is a rhabdomyosarcoma, and we can just do a simple marker and we can be sure that it is a rhabdomyosarcoma. But when it is undifferentiated, we have to go through a panel of immunohistochemical markers, and this that is when we don't have any clue. So we have to do CD45 to rule out a lymphoma. We have to think of Ewing sarcoma and ENET, and then we have to do CD99, and then to rule out a rhabdomyosarcoma, we can do Desmin and MyoD1. So when we do a MyoD1, we get a nuclear positivity. These are all the cells which are undifferentiated, which we saw in that picture, and they all have taken up MyoD1. And this is just to show the high rate of proliferation which we see in rhabdomyosarcoma. This is a Ki67 stain, and it shows that they have a high positivity, that is they have a high rate of turnover, and that is why they grow very rapidly and come back to the clinic within 2 weeks with a massive proptosis. So immunohistochemistry about when we talk about rhabdomyosarcoma, Desmin is a good stain but not very sensitive and specific. When it's an undifferentiated rhabdomyosarcoma, it is possible that the cells are very primitive and they will not take the stain, and it is still possible that Desmin can stain the other small round blue cell tumors to small extent, and it can. So in that case, what is a better stain is a MyoD1 or a myogenin. These are myoregulatory protein markers, and MyoD1 is an excellent marker for rhabdomyosarcoma. So another tumor, other small round blue cell tumors, sometimes we always ask our oncologists to send us the tissue as fresh. So when they send us tissue as fresh, what is very handy to us is a squash imprint. So when we do a squash imprint and make smears, we can see the tissue, and sometimes they give us very good clue on what kind of small round blue cell tumors they are, and also that tissue can be used for flow cytometry, and if it is a lymphoma, they are very useful adjunct. So this was squash imprint in our case of a small round blue cell tumor, and this was the PAS stain which we had done on that, and we saw this was cytoplasmic vacuoles which were PAS positive, and this is the H&E picture of the same. We are seeing a small round blue cell tumor, but because of the squash imprint and seeing the cytoplasmic vacuolations, we had two clues. That was it could be a lymphoma or a PNET, and then this was LCA, that is CD45, it was negative. So we were sure that it was not a lymphoma, and CD99 was positive. So we could know that it is Ewing sarcoma and PNET occurring in the orbit. This occurs in a little older age group as compared to rhabdomyosarcoma, and it can have more chances of involvement of the sinuses and bony involvement. So another common, not very common, yes, but we see myeloid sarcomas, which were previously known as chloromas, then they were called as the brown tumors, and then they were called as the myelogenous sarcomas, myeloblastic sarcomas, and then they were called as the granulocytic sarcomas. But currently, WHO currently favors the term myeloid sarcomas. Again, when this tumor comes, this is how the gross is. They have a greenish tinge, though this picture has been taken once it was fixed in formalin. So it did not have that green tinge after it was formalin fixed. And this is how was the microscopy. So these also look like as very undifferentiated tumors, and so they could be taken as any pleomorphic variant of a rhabdomyosarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, though they have a very blastic kind of chromatin and very irregular nuclear membrane. So when we see this contorted nuclear membrane and some cytoplasm, very pleomorphic cells, but we cannot on H&E, that is hematoxylin eosin stain, we cannot call it as a myeloid sarcoma. Again, we have to go through a panel of all immunohistochemical markers. We have to rule out a lymphoma, and that is a high-grade lymphoma. We have to rule out an undifferentiated rhabdomyosarcoma, Ewing sarcoma, PNET, and even a metastatic neuroblastoma. So we need a good clinical history. We need a radiological investigations, full systemic investigation of the patient. In addition, we need immunohistochemistry. So this is CD68. So that myeloid sarcoma was CD68. It was positive, and these myeloid sarcomas, they can have a pre-existing, or it can have a concurrent, or even later involvement with bone marrow and peripheral smear. So in that case, it was only after 6 weeks that this patient had involvement by peripheral smear by these atypical cells, which were very blastic, and the bone marrow was completely replaced by these atypical cells. So lymphoma is again another small round blue cell tumor, but a very starry sky pattern, which helps us in giving a clue of the nature of this lymphoma, that these are very high-grade tumors. I mean, a lymphoma which is very high-grade, and again the squash imprint showing the cytoplasmic vacuoles, so giving us a clue that it is a lymphoma, and this was LCA positive, CD45 positive. But this is not the end, so we have to again do a full panel of immunohistochemical markers to tell us the nature of exactly what type of lymphoma it is. And then these are the markers which we do when we get a case of lymphoma: CD20, CD3, CD10, BCL2, BCL6, 21 and 23. So Burkitt's will be positive for CD20, CD10 and BCL6. It will be negative for BCL2. Lymphangioma, a common vasculogenic tumor, and histopathologically they are characterized by large vascular dilated ectatic spaces, and they'll have this straw colored clear fluid. But the challenge is when they have large hemorrhages in them, there will be a lot of spaces which filled with blood. And then the clue which helps us, the clue is these lymphoid cells. When we see this lymphoid aggregates, then we know that it is a lymphangioma. So capillary hemangiomas, they mature with age. So when we see an hemangioma which is a very early age, they will be very cellular, and there has been times when they have been mistaken for hemangiopericytomas because they will be very poorly canalized. But when they grow with age, the canalization becomes better, and this is later when they have good lumens and nucleus, which are from plump, they have become little oval to spindle. Inflammatory lesions which we come across, I'll just jump on this inflammatory lesions and come to the optic nerve tumors. So the most common optic nerve tumor which we come in pediatric age group is the pilocytic astrocytomas, and they have this typical hair-shaped cytoplasmic processes which are elongated, and the nuclei which are spindle to round. And what helps us in IHC is GFAP, which helps in identification of these tumors. Histiocytic tumors, which could be histiocytosis X or eosinophilic granuloma or juvenile xanthogranuloma. Again, IHC helps us in differentiating some. Actually, eosinophilic granuloma will have eosinophils, and then you'll have these foam cells, two-tone type of giant cells. These two-tone giant cells are very characteristic of these xanthogranulomatous lesions. They'll have these nuclei in the center surrounded by eosinophilic cytoplasm and again a rim of foamy, pale, vacuolated cytoplasm. And there'll be some lymphocytes and plasma cells. So again, what happens here, what helps in IHC, there will be all CD68 positive, but eosinophilic granuloma will be positive for S100 and it will be CD1A positive, and you will get characteristic Burkitt granules on electron microscopy. But juvenile xanthogranuloma will be negative for S100. So to summarize, orientation to operate nexal tumors is essential. It's a teamwork of clinicians, radiologists, pathologists and oncologists which unravels the mysteries of the eye and the orbit. And what is important is to upgrade and make a uniformity in the reporting system. So I would like to acknowledge my patients, Hyderabad Eye Research Foundation, Dr. Venuganti and my institute technicians. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Ruchi. Does anyone have any questions? What is the full form of GFAP? She had talked about GFAP and astrocytomas. Can anyone tell? Since you don't have any questions, what's the full form of GFAP? Dr. Ruchi, just tell them. I think.
Yeah, so it is glial fibrillary acidic protein. I wanted to answer it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ruchi, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So now Dr. Vishnu has come, so we'll invite him to make a presentation. And he's going to talk to us about the investigative tools for orbital tumors.
Would ultimately, all the patient will present as a proptosis, and what is proptosis is, it is a forward movement of the globe in relation to the skull measured by protrusion of the apex of the cornea in front of the outer orbital ring. Normally, the protrusion would be around 14 to 21 millimeter, and an average being 16 millimeter in Indian eyes. If it is abnormal, that is greater than 20 millimeter, or the difference between the two eyes is greater than 2 millimeter, then it is considered as a proptosis, which can be axial proptosis when the eye is displayed straight outward along the anteroposterior orbital axis, especially seen in cases like thyroid ophthalmopathy or any lesion which is intracorneal, like in this case. Or it could be abaxial when the eye is pushed forward and also displays off the central axis. Some of the extracorneal tumors like pleomorphic adenoma or adenoid cystic carcinoma will have this kind of a picture. Sometimes we have a pseudoproptosis, especially seen in cases with unilateral high myopia, lid retraction and unilateral enophthalmos, like the respective cases. Now, in clinical workup of a proptosis case, we should stress upon age, duration, onset, progression, any specific association with the vision loss, diplopia, pain, swelling, any systemic illness along with that, and the past history of any thyroid disease, trauma or malignancy. Now, coming on to the examination by itself, so first and foremost we should do a thorough inspection of these patients, especially look for the subtle facial asymmetry, like this one of the patients with the dermoid cyst, as you can see here. There is a facial asymmetry on the right side where you can see there is a dermoid cyst on a CT scan. Then in patients with axial proptosis, you will have this bilateral protrusion of the eyes along with the lateral flare, a classical case of thyroid, and abaxial proptosis like in this adenoid cystic carcinoma patient. Then look for the periorbital fullness as per the lesion. But then you have to look for the skin changes which can be especially seen in vascular malformation like this reddish discoloration of the skin surrounding area, or xanthogranuloma with a bilateral lid swelling. Palpebral aperture size changes could be there in sebaceous gland carcinoma or some of the lymphomatous proliferating tumors. Now, this kind of a picture with lid retraction and a lateral flare is quite diagnostic of a thyroid ophthalmopathy. Then, to look for the position of the globe, we have these two classical views, the Navier-Stokes view, where you look on the patient from behind, and the worm's eye view, in which you look from the patient down. Now, coming on to the exophthalmometry or the poptometry, it measures the anteroposterior plane, the distance between the apex of the cornea and a bony point usually taken to the deepest portion of the lateral orbital margin, with the eye looking straight ahead. It can be of three types: absolute, wherein you compare with the known normal reading; relative, where the comparison with the relative proptosis of the two eyes is done; or a comparative, where it compares the exophthalmos of eye at different times. Now, this is what we generally use, the Hertel's exophthalmometer, and we first and foremost should always mention the bar reading, because that is one which can, falsely give the readings. And abaxial proptosis can also be documented with the help of two rulers. this is another instrument, Lutz exophthalmometer. This is a transparent plastic millimeter ruler. The notch at the end, this confirms that we are keeping it at the angle of the lateral orbital rim, and the scale reading varies from 0 to 40 millimeters. The parallax is minimized using scale on both sides of the rod. Now, further, the tumor surface has to be felt properly, especially for any nodular surface, ill-defined areas, ulceration, destruction of surrounding structure has to be noted, especially in cases of malignancy and necrotizing lesion. We have to look the conjunctival fornices in detail, like in this case with a lymphangioma or keratoderma fistula, where you can see the dilated vessels, or this is the typical Salmon patch appearances in cases of lymphoma or in cases of cavernous sinus thrombosis. Now, patients with suspected vascular malformation has to be seen both before and after Valsalva. I don't know why the video is not running. Okay, I'll show this video once. This is how we ask the patient. First and foremost, we document the lesion, then ask for a Valsalva maneuver, any kind of maneuver, and see after 30 seconds what is happening in this patient. There is an increase in the swelling in this area. So this is how a Valsalva maneuver can be done and look for vascular malformations. Back to the presentation. Sorry for the video not running here. And of course, each of the patient we have to see the fundus carefully, especially to look for visible pulsation. Along with that, all the ocular examination like best corrected visual acuity, extraocular motility, anterior and posterior segment. Especially, you have to look for the optociliary shunts in cases of to rule out schwannoma versus a meningioma patients. Now, in palpation, we have to start from the orbital rim, relax the orbital septum, and feel with a finger deep inside. Look for the location, extent, border, fixity to the bone, tenderness, any surface, temperature indicating an inflammatory lesion, the consistency, surrounding bone, and the retropulsion test. Auscultation is useful in few of the vascular lesions. And always document along with the old photographs of the patient. Now, systemic examination has definitely a role. Like this is a patient with plexiform neurofibroma. You can see these cafe alert spots. Also, a patient with a neurofibromatosis along with optic nerve glioma. So you have to look for a systemic association in such kind of a patient. Now, if the patient is presenting with bilateral proptosis and if he is an adult, look for these three causes importantly: the thyroiditis, the lymphoproliferative disease, or a bilateral cavernous sinus thrombosis accordingly. And in children with a bilateral proptosis, you should look for a leukemia, neuroblastoma, orbital cellulitis kind of a thing. If the patient is presenting with axial proptosis, most and foremost, it will be like a thyroid ophthalmopathy, either a meningioma if in an old patient, optic nerve glioma if the patient is in first decade, or a cavernous hemangioma if it is in female in 30s or 40s. And non-axial proptosis, you should look for a lacrimal gland tumor, schwannoma, dermoids, mucocele, or lymphoma. If the swelling is there from birth, then we have to look for meningocele, teratoma, hemangioma, hematoma, or encephalocele kind of a picture. In children's, I think ma'am has already covered the lesions in children, and in adult you have to look for thyroiditis, lacrimal gland tumor, again cavernous hemangioma, pseudotumor, varix, mucocele. Now this is the patient with a meningocele, as you can see in this patient. Then teratoma is one of the rare cases to be seen. This slide I have borrowed from Dr. Neelam Kushwaha, where you can see there is in this will have an ectodermal, mesodermal, or kind of endodermal elements along with the normal swelling. So, and in lymphangioma, as you can see that pediatric lymphangiomas, where you can see this multiple subtections in the lesion, and this chocolate kind of the typical picture of a chocolate cyst, causing an acute presentation of the patients. Again, few patients with lymphangioma. Now, RMS, patients will present in first decade with a rapid unilateral proptosis with globe dysplasium, and CT scan will show irregular margins and often bony distortion. I think most of these are covered by Dr. Ruchi already. Again, in like leukemic deposits, granulocytic sarcoma, and leukemia. And coming on to the lacrimal gland tumors, I briefly touch upon the clinical features of this. This will be like younger patient with painless proptosis, probably more than 1 year. And pain is sometimes seen in less than 10% of the patient, but if the pain is present, it goes more in favor of adenoid cystic carcinoma. This is the patient with recurrent pleomorphic adenoma following an incomplete removal. As you can see, there is a slight bony erosion. So, if the incomplete removal has been done, it can masquerade a picture like an adenoid cystic. Now coming on to adenoid cystic itself, these will be the patient with proptosis with less than 1 year, and pain will be almost seen in 80% of the patient along with paresthesia, along with bony destruction on a CT scan. Now cavernous hemangioma, as we all know, these will be well localized tumor, mostly intraconal with an axial proptosis like this. Sometimes they will be on inferior orbit. Schwannoma again is quite well demarcated. On USG it will have a round configuration, and these can be easily excised in toto. Lymphoma will be the one, either a primary or a secondary metastatic. These kind of orbital tumors can also be there. And almost in adults, metastatic orbital tumors will be around the globe and not inside the, like in pediatric patient. So metastasis to metastasis will be from the either breast, lung, and prostate cancer, and sometimes in melanoma. And almost 10 to 15% of this patient will have an unknown primary. So we have to do a PET CT in such kind of patients. That is all, I think. This is how a clinical evaluation of an orbital tumor should go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vishnu. If there are any other questions from Dr. Vishnu, please you can ask. Vishnu, is it necessary that all the non-axial cases that you're talking about, like Schwannomas, they always have non-axial proptosis, or unusually they can have axial proptosis?
Schwannoma sometimes can have an axial proptosis also. And obviously cavernous hemangioma will it's not an hard and fast rule, but most of the time a cavernous hemangioma will have a kind of axial proptosis. But if it outgrows the intraconal compartment and goes extraconally also, it will have an axial proptosis.
Any questions for Dr. Vishnu?
Thank you.
Next is my presentation. I will be telling you about the histopathology of orbital tumors. So like Dr. Ruchi has said, when a tumor comes from the operation theatre to the pathology lab, we have to decide whether it is actually an inflammatory lesion or a tumor. Then the next question is it benign or malignant? If it is malignant, we need to grade and stage it. And after we know whether it's either benign or malignant, whether it's an epithelial or a mesenchymal tumor, then whether it's primary or metastatic, and our final diagnosis rests on light microscopy. And in case light microscopy is not confirmatory, we have to resort to special investigations, which is immunohistochemistry. So basically, immunohistochemistry will help us to localize the type of tumor. It does not help us to tell us whether it's benign or malignant. That should be very clear. So by light microscopy, by histopathology, we are able to tell you the type of lesion it is and whether it is benign or malignant. Immunohistochemistry will only tell us what type of lesion it is. So in the orbit now, we can have primary tumors, which are from the various structures in the orbit. The primary tumors can be mesenchymal tumors, or they can be epithelial tumors. Epithelial tumors are mainly from the lacrimal gland. And we can also have extranodal lymphomas. Then the secondary tumors can be direct extensions from the adjoining structures, or they can be lymphoproliferative disorders, which are now presented as lymphomas in the orbit, and then we can have metastatic tumors. Now this is the spectrum of the orbital lesions in an analysis we have done at our center. So you can clearly make out that secondary metastatic tumors are fairly common in the orbit, and they accounted for about 20% of the lesions. And following that, the lacrimal gland lesions, the vascular tumors, and the benign mesenchymal tumors are round about 15% each, and the lymphoproliferative disorders are around 8%. The malignant mesenchymal tumors are pretty low. They are accounted for just about 4% of the lesions. Now coming to the primary orbital tumors, I'll first focus on the lacrimal gland tumors. The commonest lacrimal gland tumors are the pleomorphic adenomas. They account for 76% of the lesions, and the next common are the adenoid cystic carcinomas. And the rest of the malignant, the lacrimal gland tumors are not so common. So, how do we diagnose a pleomorphic adenoma? The diagnosis starts at the grossing table. You can make out that they are pretty well circumscribed lesions, and they've got a glistening appearance. And the glistening nature is because they have a component of the mesenchymal element. So they are also called mixed tumors. So you can see very clearly they have the epithelial component, which is ductular, and then the mesenchymal component, which is caused by the myoepithelial component, and the cell of origin is the ductular cells. Even though they are benign tumors, they are known to recur, and they can even result in malignancy later on. Now coming to the next common is the adenoid cystic carcinoma. As you can make out, when we are grossing these tumors, as compared to the pleomorphic adenomas, they are not so well circumscribed and they are more solid appearing. And microscopically, there are 5 histological types. And why do we need to histologically type the adenoid cystic carcinomas? Because the prognosis depends on them. See, in most of the adenoid cystic carcinomas have this classical Swiss cheese pattern. So these have a better prognosis. Whereas the solid pattern, that is the basaloid variant, has got a worse prognosis. And the another common thing about adenoid cystic carcinomas, which Vishnu had talked about, is the perineural invasion. So we as pathologists should look for perineural invasion as well as vascular invasion, because that will make the prognosis worse for the patients. Now then there are rare lateral gland tumors. There are tumors like microepidermoid carcinomas, then epithelial, myoepithelial carcinomas. It is very important for us as pathologists to differentiate these from the adenoid cystic carcinomas, because the prognosis in these tumors is much better than adenoid cystic carcinomas, and we have to resort to a panel of immunohistochemical markers. Now coming to the staging in lateral gland tumors, although we usually do not stage lateral gland tumors, it is important that we start staging lateral gland tumors. And the staging is based firstly on the size of the tumors. If it is less than 2 centimeters, they are low grade. They are T1, and if they are more than 2 to 4 centimeters, it is T2. And if bone invasion is present, they are called as T3 and T4. And then the low grade and the high grade variants are also there, depending on the histology. Pleomorphic adenomas, which become malignant, come into the low grade category, whereas adenoid cystic carcinomas are regarded as very high grade tumors. So histopathology is very important for further management of lateral gland tumors. Now coming to the vascular tumors, they have already been discussed. They account for about 15% of the orbital tumors, and on the grossing table we see them as very darkly stained, violaceous color tumors, well circumscribed, and they got a very spongy appearance. And you can make out the vascular channels, they are thick walled. You can see the muscle in the walls. In contrast, lymphangiomas, which Dr. Ruchi talked about, they have got irregular vascular channels and very thin walled. Mangiopericytomas now come into the differential diagnosis of mesenchymal tumors, and they are very erratic tumors. Like on histopathology, we will not be able to tell you how it's going to behave. One particular mangiopericytoma might have no mitotic figures, but it might metastasize. Another one might have 5 mitotic figures, but it might remain benign. So it's very important to follow up these patients. They have very unpredictable behavior. So this is how an hemangiopericytoma looks like. Basically, it's a spindle cell tumor. When you see these vascular channels in between, we call it a hemangiopericytic pattern. And on higher magnification, you can see these are the vascular channels. This is the typical Staghorn pattern, and they stain positive for SMA and focally for CD34. And most of the benign ones are supposed to have mitosis less than 4 per hyperfield. Now, a very important differential diagnosis for pathologists is the solitary fibrous tumor, which mimics hemangiopericytoma, but it has got a much better prognosis. So, how do we differentiate it from hemangiopericytoma? See, on gross examination, you can see they are not so violaceous. They are more fibrous appearing. The reason is because on histopathology also we have these bands of fibrous tissue, and the we have to resort to immunohistochemistry, and you can see the CD34 stain is diffusely and very strongly positive in solitary fibrous tumors, whereas in hemangiopericytomas it is focally positive. Another marker which helps us is BCL2, which is more positive in solitary fibrous tumors. So we should, as pathologists, be very careful, as SFTs are quite often undiagnosed. Now coming to the lymphomas, which Dr. Ruchi had covered. In adults also we can have non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, which can present as primary masses or as a result of the secondary, and most of them are low-grade lymphomas. And immunohistochemically, most of them are B cell type. These are those of the myeloma type or the low-grade extranodal lymphomas. They have a good prognosis, but they need to be followed up for systemic spread. Now coming to Langerhans cell histiocytosis, which Dr. Ruchi had touched upon, this is once again a systemic disease. And like Dr. Vishnu has said, we need to do a systemic workout and see whether other parts of the bodies are involved. And microscopically, we have these typical Langerhans cells, which are positive on CD1A and S100. And this is the electron microscopic view, which is showing typical Burbeck granules. This is confirmatory for Langerhans cell histiocytosis. Now coming to the smallest portion of the mesenchymal tumors, which are a big headache for the histopathologists, because all of them look like spindle cell tumors, and we have to use our acumen and decide which of the various malignant tumors is. Though actually for management point of view it might not be so important, but being pathologists we are not satisfied till we know the cell of origin. So most of them, like I said, are spindle cell tumors, and we are trained as pathologists to diagnose by patterns. Like storiform patterns are for fibrous histiocytomas, but it might not be correct. You might have other tumors like hemangiopericytomas which have a storiform pattern. So there's a lot of overlap in the patterns. So ultimately we have to resort to immunohistochemistry, and as I told earlier, malignancy we should diagnose only by cytological features. So this is the panel of immunohistochemical markers which we can resort to. Vimentin will be positive in all mesenchymal tumors. Desmin and actin are smooth and skeletal markers. S100 protein is for neural tumors like schwannomas, neurofibromas, and CD34 help us to diagnose hemangiopericytomas and solitary fibrous tumors. This is the immunohistochemical stain to show Vimentin positive which is positive in all mesenchymal tumors. So basically it helps us to differentiate from epithelial tumors. This is a stain for Desmin, which helps us to characterize rhabdomyosarcomas. Now fibrous histiocytomas, earlier in pathology there were a lot of tumors which were diagnosed as fibrous histiocytomas, but now it is said the most recent concept is this is the rarest tumors, and it is because pathologists can't make can't subtype the mesenchymal tumors, so we dump them as fibrous histiocytomas. So actually they are not very common. And it is a diagnosis by exclusion. A case which is S100 negative, CD34 negative, most of the markers are negative, but it is Vimentin positive, which has got a characteristic storiform pattern. Storiform pattern means a cartwheel pattern. That is supposed to be a fibrous histiocytoma. They can again be benign, locally aggressive or malignant, and this is based on the presence of the mitotic figures. Now coming to the peripheral nerve sheath tumors, they are quite common at our setup, and they are often misdiagnosed even as inflammatory tumors because they are known to present as marked cystic degeneration, and the cases which are diagnosed as cystic sarcosis or hydatid cyst also by the ophthalmologist, and they really don't believe us when they give the diagnosis. I've had ophthalmologists who say, ma'am, you please look at the slide once again. Is it really a schwannoma? So I think as ophthalmologists it's a big diagnostic dilemma. But fortunately for us as pathologists, it's quite a simple affair because they are spindle cell tumors, and they've got a very typical S-shaped nucleus, these neurofibromas, and on S100 they are positive. So when we are seeing a neurofibroma, it's a neurofibroma, it can't be an hydatid cyst. Then neurofibromas can also be plexiform neurofibromas. The differentiation in this case, unlike the diffuse neurofibromas, is we have these bundles of nerve fibers surrounded by a perineurium, and we have to investigate, like Dr. Vishnu said, for von Wetling-Host's disease. And schwannomas have got the typical Antony A and Antony B areas. They are encapsulated. These are the Berruquet bodies in which you have palisading of the nuclei, and these are the Antony A areas, and these are the loose Antony B areas. They are also S100 positive, and these are usually associated with neurofibromatosis type 2, and which you should look for meningiomas associated and schwannomas. So optic nerve gliomas have been already covered by Dr. Ruchi. The next important tumors are the meningiomas. They have got typical Samoma bodies, and the EMS stain is positive. Smooth muscle tumors are very rare. Fibroosseous tumors are also very rare. We have occasional cases of fibroblastic fibrous dysplasias, in which we have this woven bone, and they lack the osteoblastic rimming. In contrast to the fibrous ossifying fibromas, they have a lining, osteoblastic lining. Chordromas are called cartilaginous tumors. They are also very rare, and we have a whole lot of rare orbital tumors which I will not be covering. Some of these tumors which will be covered by Dr. Kashyap and Dr. Bhavna in the next session. Now finally, after all the panel of immunohistochemical stains, if we are unable to diagnose, many of the tumors we say it is an undifferentiated or a poorly differentiated malignant mesenchymal tumor. We are unable to classify it. But however, we should still try and grade it so that they can be given radiotherapy or chemotherapy, and this is based on the recent AGCC staging, which is based on mainly on the size of the tumors. And the cutoff is 15 millimeters between T1 and T2. And finally, now the metastatic tumors and the secondary tumors, they form a big chunk of 20% of the tumors. We have tumors from the eyelid, from the conjunctiva, from the intraocular spaces, as well as from the meninges. They all infiltrate the orbit. In children, the neuroblastomas are very common. Dr. Vishnu talked about it. These are diagnosed by small round cell tumors, which are positive by neurofilaments. And adults, intraorbital metastasis is much rare. Intraocular is commoner. And these we again diagnosed by a panel of immunohistochemical markers. CK helps us to diagnose epithelial malignancies. HMB45 is for malignant melanomas, and neuroblastomas is neurofilaments. Thank you. Any questions?
Dr. Seema, I've seen a case of fibrous histiocytoma, which was very spongy and vascular, highly vascular. And I've seen a case of solitary fibrous tumor. I would like to understand the difference between these two clinical features based on histopathology.
Actually, in histopathology, if a solitary fibrous tumor has got the storiform pattern, then it can be difficult to differentiate, but we could get a CD44 stain done, 34 stain done. If it is a fibrous histiocytoma, it has to be CD34 negative.
Now, what gives the quality of that spongy vascular nature?
Usually solitary fibrous tumors have got the hemangiopericytomous pattern, but you can have fibrous histiocytomas which are very vascular. So it's not that fibrous histiocytomas have to be very fibrous always, they can be vascular, but we need to do an immunohistochemical stain to distinguish, because CD34 will be this clinching thing. Fibrous histiocytomas are never CD34 positive, but they can be vascular. So the blood vessels are not a part of the tumor, it's the mesenchymal cells which are malignant, and we look for CD34 in the mesenchymal cells. So fibrous histiocytomas will be negative even if they are vascular and they mimic SFTs.
So it's a type of mesenchymal cell which will make the difference?
Yeah.
Between solid and spongy?
No, the spongy appearance could be because of the vascular channels which are present in the fibrous histiocytoma. So actually there's a lot of overlap between these mesenchymal tumors, but we need to work as a team and then look at the radiology and the immunohistochemistry and then make a story out of it.